Well, welcome to the Sunday School lesson. I hope you have your Bibles open. Open them, please, to the 13th chapter of the book of Luke, the 20th verse. Chapter 15, verses 20 through 32 will be our lesson for today. Now, some of the background. We're going to be looking primarily at the story of the prodigal son. But the background of this is, of course, reunion. Now, some reunions are very pleasant. I remember when I was just a kid growing up, about every couple or 3 years, we'd have a family reunion with the Clendenin family. Now, there was a large family. My mother was one of 13 children. So it was a large family, and they all had large families except my mother. There were only two of us, but she had one sister that had 10, one who had 11, one who had 9, one who had 5. It was just a big family. And so we would go to the family reunion. And it was always a good time, good food, fried chicken, mashed potatoes. I mean, it was just a good time. But not all reunions are fun. Not all reunions are fun. There are times when trust has been broken, hurt has come, and when those people get back together, it's not a fun time. So we want to look at the story of the prodigal son in terms of the reunion that he has back with his father and with his older brother and what that reunion looks like. Now, in the background of this, there's also the parable of the guest who did not come to open the door. There's also the background of the parable of the banquet, that people use excuses to get out of what they had already agreed to. Then there's the story of Lazarus and the rich man and the danger of waiting too late. Each parable, these people must respond to what has been said about Jesus. Now, when we come to the story of the prodigal son, this is another one of those places where I love to preach. And let me just give you my sermon outline, and it'll show up a time or two as I move through, I assure you. I love to preach on the prodigal son because I've had to deal with a lot of prodigal children, not all necessarily mine, but in my ministry, in my life, in my pastorate in particular. I had to help other people deal with their prodigal children, even though they'd grown up in the church. I remember one fine young man who is a lawyer in the city today, and I remember I was part of an intervention for him with his family. And he disliked me for a long time, and then finally came to the realization that what we did for him was the best thing we could possibly have done for him. So when I see him now and his family now, it's a time of reunion, a time of good reunion. So let's look at this in those terms and see the story of the prodigal son. Now, the son, apparently, the younger son, was a very arrogant young man. Now, that's the background before we get to verse 20. Verse 20 is right in the middle of something that's taking place in his life. But the young man, we don't know how old he was, how young he was, but the young man came to his father and in arrogance said, "I want my share of the inheritance." Well, the truth of the matter is he didn't have any share of the inheritance unless his father wanted him to have it, because normally the inheritance went to the first child, to the first son. But the inheritance is not the issue here. It's the arrogance of the young man who asked. Now, for some reason, and Scripture does not say, other than probably the father loved the boy, had the best hopes of what he was going to do with his inheritance, and though probably had fixed in the back of his mind that may not be what happens. And so in the background, this arrogance of the young man who asked his father for an inheritance before his father had died. And he came to this understanding, and we don't know why, but the father granted him the inheritance and allowed him to take his leave to the far country. And you know the story, that there he spent his money, and he spent his money in riotous living. Now, I don't have to give you a guess on what riotous living in. That means I live like I want to. I live like all hell wants me to, and I throw my money around, and as long as I have money, I have friends. But when my money runs out, my friends are gone as well. They were only there for what they could get. So that's what happened to the young man. He spent everything in riotous living. Everything. And then he had to get a job. Now you can imagine what a put down it was to get a job after being the toast of the town. He had to get a job. The only one he could find was feeding pigs, which was absolutely unconscionable for a Jewish boy. Now, I jotted down in the margin of my notes, this young man sinned against his father and his family. Keep this in mind. He sinned against his father and his family. This young man sinned against his faith. It had to do with the inheritance. He sinned against what all of the other parents were going to do with the inheritance to the firstborn and so forth. And that doesn't mean that the firstborn got everything, but the firstborn got the major portion. He sinned against his culture. And the culture was that pigs are absolutely not a part of society. They are useless, they are worthless, and Jews hated pigs, period. And here he was, slopping the hogs. Now that's not the end of the story. He sinned against himself. He would have eaten the same things the hogs were eating. Whatever that was. Now, we called it swirl where I grew up. It was in a barrel. You hated to take the bucket and get it and slop the hogs. It was not a fun job. I had to do it a few times. It was not a fun job to slop the hogs. And he would have eaten the same thing they ate. And do you know what? No man offered him even that. So now he gets to the place, not only is he broke, is he homeless, has a job that he doesn't want, and now he's hungry, maybe for the first time in his life. At least is that a hunger pain that drives him to do some conscientious thinking. And that's where we pick up our story for today in verse 20, Luke 15, verses 20 and 21. Luke 15, verses 20 and 21. And he arose and came to his father. When he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto them, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight. I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Now this idea of he arose, probably the New International Version has the best translation I found. He came to his senses. He came to his senses. He finally realized this is not going to cut it. I can't stay here in the pig pen. I'm hungry. I'm broke. I'm tired. I'm homeless. All I have is what I have on, and it's dirty. It's filthy. I am going to go to my father. And I'm going to say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven. I have sinned against you. I've sinned against myself. I've sinned against culture. I've sinned against every conceivable part of life. But I'm hungry. Let me go to work on the farm. Let me go to work for you. Make me one of your hired servants. He had this speech all prepared for his father. And as he came to the father saw him. And when he was still a great way off, he ran, had compassion on him. And that compassion that he had on him, he fell on him and kissed him. Now, I want you to think this through with me. This is not just a surface kind of story. Something vital is going on here. One of the ideas is when his father saw him, he was a great way off. The implication is his father had been watching for him all this time. His father was anticipating that his son eventually was going to come back home. Isn't that the way a father thinks? When there's trouble in the family, when there's trouble between a father and a son, doesn't he always anticipate he's going to come back home? And so he saw him a great way off, and he ran toward him, toward the son. And I'm sure the son might have been running toward the father. But nonetheless, when they met, he did some things. He saw him. He had compassion on him. At the very sight of the boy, he had compassion. And he came with all of the filth and all of the dirt. You cannot imagine what his breath must have smelled like, what his body must have smelled like. You just can't imagine someone. Well, you probably could imagine if you've ever been in places where people are just simply filthy. They're just filthy. And as a result of that, nothing smells good. Nothing around them looks good. But here's the father. Here's the son in these tattered clothes. It's a father. And he runs and meets him, has compassion. Isn't it amazing that he could have compassion on this son who had taken part of what he had lived for and part of what he had spent his life building up and had wasted it in riotous living, threw it away, yet he had compassion. And above all else, he kissed him. In that filthy condition, he kissed him. And that in itself let the son know, as he tried to speak the words to the father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight. I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me like one of the hired servants. And when this came out of the mouth of the son, the father began to make other things known before he is going to call him his son again. Now, look at verses 22 through 24. 22 through 24 of chapter 15. But the father said to his servants, bring forth the fatted lamb. By the way, if you'll notice verse 21, the boy never did get to say all he wanted to say. He had intended to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight. I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me one of your hired servants. His father never gave him the opportunity to proclaim that. So the son, bring forth, verse 22 of chapter 15. Bring forth the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring hither the fatted calf, kill it, let's be merry. For my son was dead, and he is alive again. He is lost, and he is found. And they began to be merry. So here's the father, and here's the sequence of events that he wants to happen for his son, his younger son who has come home. Number one, bring forth the best robe. Take this garment off of him. Take these filthy rags off of him. Put the best robe we have on him. Now, this idea of the robe was a reconnection between the Father and the Son. It was almost like a king and a prince. The robe had some meaning, some distinct meaning for the boy. And he got to put on the robe. He said, not only do I want you to put on the best robe, remove all of the shame, take off these dirty garments. I don't want him to remember anything about the pig pen. I want him to remember how he was treated when he came home to his father. So he said, bring the best robe. The father also ordered the servants, don't let him put on the robe. You put the robe on him. You put the robe on him. And then he says, put shoes on his feet. Apparently the boy was barefooted. He didn't even have shoes. This idea of shoes on the feet meant something to the father. He was going to be a son again. He needed to look like a son again. And then he says, put a ring on his hand. My father gave me a ring, our family. Put this ring on his hand. Now, I'm not big on rings, never have been. I wear a wedding band. That's about all I've ever worn. Now, I've had some nice rings, and finally, recently, just gave them to my son. I had a ring that when I graduated from my doctor's degree from Southwestern Seminary. Beautiful ring. Beautiful ring. A rather costly ring. But I just was uncomfortable wearing it because of the size of it. And then I had a ring when I was pastor at the Broadmoor Baptist Church in Shreveport. We got a ring after we'd been there 5 years. We got the ring. And then each year after that, we got a diamond in the ring. It was a nice ring. Milton Herbert, who was a jeweler by trade, actually made the rings for us, and they were just absolutely gorgeous. And the church paid for them, and they paid for each diamond that went in the ring. It's really a nice ring, but I never was comfortable wearing the ring. So I had the rings, had them put up, had them in a box. And recently, I guess because of Nancy's death and having to give away part of her jewelry, I guess I just thought, well, I ought to do this while I can. And so I gave both rings to my son. Those are the only two rings I have. But both of those rings, now whether he ever wears them or not, I don't know. If he has them melted down and put into something else, that's okay with me. But whatever he does, he needs to remember what the rings meant to me. Now, they may not mean exactly the same thing. They meant to me 11 1/2 years of one institution without missing a semester to get the education I believe God wanted me to have. That's what the ring represents. 14 years of ministry in the same place. 14 years of good ministry in the same place. And the joy and the happiness we had in that place. That's what the ring meant to me from the Broadmoor Baptist Church. So it's not the ring itself. It's what the ring symbolizes that makes the difference. So the father said, put a ring on his finger. He's restored to the family. He's part of us again. My son was dead and he's alive. He was lost and he's found. He's part of us again. Put a ring on his finger. And then the last thing he tells them to do is bring hither the fatted calf. We're going to kill the fatted calf. Now, I don't know much about livestock. I've been around it quite a bit. I've pastored twice in dairy farming communities. But I do know this. When you are getting ready to butcher a calf, when you're getting ready to butcher the calf or the cow, whatever it might be, There is a period of time that you set it aside and you feed it more grain than you would ordinarily, and it pearls the meat. At least that's what they told me. I take their word for it. It pearls their meat. So the fatted calf was the one that they had for special occasion only would they kill the fatted calf, because that calf had been set aside, had been fed grain, the meat had pearled correctly, and now had come the time they were going to kill the fatted calf. Now, this is a celebratory kind of thing. This is a celebration that we would have a hard time imagining. It's a celebration of reunion that's going to come. And the best thing that ever happened at family reunions was the good food, as far as we were concerned as children, as boys. Oh, the food was absolutely wonderful. And so the reunion always has to do with the eating of good food. And they killed the fatted calf. It's a celebratory thing to kill the fatted calf. And now, when he kills the fatted calf and they begin to celebrate, this my son was dead, he was lost, and now he's in his father's arms again, he's found. And they began to be merry. And then something happens that's just a little unusual, maybe more unusual than I think, but is a little unusual, beginning with verse 25. Verse 25. Now his elder brother was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing, called one of the servants and asked them what this meant. Thy brother has come, thy father has killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out, entreated him. He answered, saying to his father, I've served you all of these years. You have never even given me a party. Isn't that an unusual thing? Here's the elder brother, probably still brooding over the fact that his brother took the money and spent it in riotous living. Probably jealousy. I don't know what was wrong with the elder brother. Maybe he had just worked so hard that day, and when he came to find out that the party wasn't on his behalf, he had worked so hard, he could not understand why his father was doing all of this, and he simply became so upset that he was angry about it. Now, he wasn't just upset, he was angry about it all, and reminded his father of all that he had done. And when he got this news of his brother, it was unexpected news. He probably thought his brother was dead and his brother was gone. His brother was not coming back home. Now, I don't know whether there was any love lost between him and his brother before he left home or not. There seems to be some resentment of the older brother toward the younger brother. I don't understand all of that, but it seems like you ought to rejoice when something good happens like this, especially when it's happening to your father whom you love, and the father who's going to give you all of his inheritance. And his father reminds him, I know you've worked hard. I understand that you've worked hard. But do you understand that everything I have now is yours? It's an oddity almost. It's a paradox almost. Even the fatted calf that was killed for the party of the younger brother literally was owned by the older brother. So here he had all of the inheritance. Everything his father had was now his. And he understood that. And that's what his father could not understand. I understand you've been with me. You've done everything I've asked you to do. You've been an ideal son. You've worked hard. The crops are good. The cattle's good. Everything is good. I understand that, and I'm so appreciative. Everything I have, you have. That didn't seem to satisfy him. So, all of these years, you never even had a party for me and for my friends. And then he reminded him, this is your brother. This is my son. Now, you know the story of the prodigal son. He comes home, his brother gets angry. Isn't it an amazing thing how we cannot rejoice when others rejoice? It's an amazing thing to me how we miss so much because it didn't happen to us and it didn't happen in our behalf. Oh, listen, my friends, we need to learn to rejoice when others rejoice. We need to weep when others weep. Here's what I believe the prodigal son story is trying to tell us. God is the Father, and He's the waiting Father. He's waiting for us to come to our senses and come to Him. And He does the same thing for us that this Father did for His Son. He cleans us up, puts the robe on us, puts the ring on our finger to welcome us back to welcome us into the family, and loves us as part of the family. I am amazed at the amazing grace of God in my behalf. When I stop to think how I could have been that prodigal boy and stayed out in the pig pen and missed out on the best of life, I have to rejoice every time some soul comes to Christ. Not only should the angels in heaven rejoice, but the saints on the earth should rejoice. Be glad when others are blessed. Enter into the joy that they have in the Lord. Well, I'm glad you joined me today. I hope you know Jesus, who lived and died to save you from your sin. And like the prodigal boy, if you haven't, come to your senses. God bless you.